Our final keynote address of the conference will be Ambassador Timo Koster, the Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Koster will discuss the criticality of international partnerships in defending forward.
Good afternoon. Oh wait, I have to switch this on, I believe. Yep, better. Good afternoon. So I'm acutely aware of the fact that that this is the graveyard shift and that I'm the very last speaker on a 2-day conference, and that I'm keeping you from either going home or having a drink, but or both probably. Anyway, I'm still excited to be here. I was speaking with my wife on the phone yesterday, and I said, so I'm here in Washington and speaking to a conference of the SciCon defense people, and would you have ever imagined in your wildest dreams that I would be invited to come to Washington to speak about cyber matters to such an esteemed audience? And she said, well, in my wildest dreams you don't appear at all. So having said that, I'll try to tell you a little bit about what we worry about in the Netherlands and how we try to shape the policy mix, the toolbox that we think we need to make cyberspace a safer place, because we believe that cyber stability is vital. Stability in cyberspace actually promotes and contributes to a more stable society and a more stable democracy and a more stable business environment. And the specific interest that we have in the Netherlands is, first, we have an open economy. We're part of the European Union. Our borders are open. We're a small country, and we depend heavily on trade and services flowing in and out of the country. For those who were here this morning, know that we have a vast, especially for a small country, a vast internet infrastructure. The transatlantic cables actually land in Amsterdam, in Amsterdam Internet Exchange, and we have, for that reason, a lot of server parks, infrastructure that we, on the one hand, need to protect, and on the other hand, need to make sure that they are accessible and open. We have at least one more reason why we really care about these things. Netherlands is unique in a sense that we are one of the very, very few countries that have the promotion of the international rules-based order inscribed into our constitution. So it's actually a task of the government and a task of an ambassador representing that government to further the international rules-based order. So it's not enough to just talk about it. We have to, as a task of the government, build structures that actually make that happen. Now, as everyone knows, the internet so far has developed from a great promise for more democratic intercourse, for economic chances, etc. It has developed from being that promise to a fairly dark place where a lot of things can go wrong, and where to a certain extent there's an amount of lawlessness that we have to find. So we are building a policy mix with which we are trying to discourage those who mean harm. We distinguish roughly crime, so the ordinary criminals trying to steal your money or peddle child pornography and that kind of things. On the one hand, terrorists and those who try to recruit people or incite people with their harmful content through the internet. And then thirdly, state actors. It's clear that there's a number of bad guys. Mike Rogers yesterday showed 4 leaders of four countries that he was most worried about, and I think that is pretty accurate. It's pretty accurate to say that those 4 worry us the most as well. So especially that I'm going to talk about how we try to influence the behavior of those state actors and try to, let's say, influence the calculation of those countries, those actors that believe that they can do harm at our expense. or at other one's expense, but on our soil. So yeah, the way we think about this is that it's a sort of a continuum, a spectrum of different measures. I use the term response continuum. And it starts on the left with resilience, of course. Resilience being the ability to withstand a crisis, and plus the ability to function through a crisis, because we will never be able to avert every crisis. We will see things that will affect us, and a crisis, a cyber crisis, can take many forms. Another unique feature of the Netherlands is that 2/3 of our country is below sea level. So you can imagine that the waterworks that we have to keep the sea out are mostly computer-operated walls and doors, giant doors that literally close off waterways. If we have an adversary that is able to take over those bits of infrastructure and open or close those doors at will, you can understand that that's a big deal that will immediately affect millions of people in our country. So resilience is a big thing, and I would almost say you never have enough resilience, and there's never enough that you can do, and it's a developing thing that we have to keep at all the time. And of course, resilience is not just about our own resilience, because it's, let's say, internet threats are just like climate change. They don't stop at the border, so we need to make sure that our neighbors and our partners and allies are resilient in the same way. If you move along that response spectrum, we work hard in getting international norms agreed, norms for state behavior in cyberspace. I mentioned it this morning as well. There's, at this moment, not one, but 2 parallel UN tracks to negotiate norms. So there's a set of norms that is out there already. We want nations to refrain from certain behavior. The interesting thing is we have a widespread agreement already since 2015 in the United Nations that certain things are inadmissible. For instance, attacking critical infrastructure. The funny thing is that those 193 countries, amongst those countries are also those actors that actually do us harm. So just agreeing those norms is not enough. And I would like to point to a report that was just issued last week in Paris by the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, a 3-year project. It's cyberstability.org if you want to have a look at the report. It was sponsored by the Netherlands, and it has not produced entirely new norms, but has produced a couple of what you would call sub-norms. So it doesn't only talk about vital infrastructure, but for instance, it spells out that one of the things that it entails is election infrastructure, very topical, I think, also in this country, that is something that needs to be protected. And it also talks about the public core of the internet, so the undersea cables that you cannot tamper with. So cyberstability.org, and you will find the GCSC report. Of course, those norms in themselves are not enough. Clearly, that we get nations to follow those norms without any conviction or any compelling from our side. There are a couple of countries that would like to see that translated into treaties. We don't believe that that is necessary at this moment. In the other panel, we talked about this. International law does apply online and offline, so we don't necessarily need to see immediate new treaties. But intellectually, you can understand that at some point it might be necessary to codify some of those norms and make things more precise. But if you compare it, for example, if you look at cyber as a domain, like the high seas, we have navigated the high seas for centuries before we had a UN treaty on the high seas, the UNCLOS treaty that sets rules for behavior on the high seas is as young as from 1994. Now you know how long we have been sailing the high seas without international rules, so you can understand that that takes a while. But thinking about cyber as a weapon, you have a similar parallel. During the First World War, chemical weapons were completely acceptable. And during the Second World War, mass bombing of civilian centers was also totally acceptable. Over time, over the decades, an international understanding grew that there is a norm that you cannot use chemical weapons. You can no longer, at least a number of nations believe that, no longer use landmines, anti-personnel mines. You cannot bomb civilian centers to defeat an enemy. And it came to the point that actually now chemical weapons are actually banned through a treaty, and that in my hometown, The Hague, there is the institute, the OPCW, that actually implements those rules. So if you think far ahead, it's possible that norms will turn into specific cyber rules at some point. Along that same spectrum, that response spectrum, we also do a lot of capacity building. We realize that we have to make other countries as strong as we are in cyberspace. And capacity building means, you can call it development aid in cyberspace. There's a lot of countries that are not at the same level of development in terms of their own governance structure, in terms of their own resilience, and even in terms of understanding what the issues are. So we spend a lot of money and effort on getting those countries up to the same level. There's an institute that's called the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, also a Dutch invention, so we had the Global Commission for Cybersecurity. And if there's anything that has the Netherlands, that has global and cyber in the same title, it's probably from the Netherlands. The Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, GFCE, is a collective of countries and institutes, NGOs, and cybersecurity firms that work together to spread these best practices and help nations to get better at their cybersecurity. And there's still a lot to do. Even further than these kind of soft tools, we're working with nations on what we call CBMs, confidence building measures. Ask nations to be transparent about what kind of tools they have at their disposal, under what kind of circumstances they would use them, and in that sense create stability through transparency. And of course, law enforcement is another tool that we have at our disposal. Sometimes if something is not necessarily an armed attack or an act of war, we talked about it this morning, there's always a possibility of putting your law enforcement apparatus on it and try and hold those accountable that do us harm. Even if it's state actors, we can bring states actually before the court and try to sentence them. But the most important thing is that if we want to be able to influence the calculation of Mr. Putin or who else means us harm, we have to be able to impose consequences. And we can only impose consequences if we're actually able to see what is happening and attribute. And attribution is, as everyone here knows, is one of the most difficult things to do in cyberspace, but it's critical, and we need to get better at it. Our foreign minister made a speech last week in Paris when that GCSE report was issued, and said that we're going to forge alliances with not just with other states, but also with tech companies, with the Googles and the cybersecurity firms, with Microsoft, but also with NGOs. For example, the Cyber Peace Institute that's being set up in Geneva at the moment. All those actors have a piece of the puzzle. We, as the state, do not own all the information that we need to do technical attribution. So we're setting up alliances with a number of states and a number of companies to see if we can get better at that. The difficulty, of course, is that some of these companies, for instance, cybersecurity firms, what they do is they try to prevent a problem, and when a problem occurs, they try to fix it. They do not necessarily stay with the problem to find out which person in which building, in which country actually has done this. And that's something that, so we need to get better at that as well. I was in Singapore not too long ago, spoke with Interpol, and they, of course, they're after cyber criminals. but they see a lot of other things that could actually be very helpful to us. So such a initiative to get better at technical attribution is vital for us to influence the behavior of those who mean us harm. In this country, of course, you have a defense doctrine that's called persistent engagement, persistent presence, sorry. We don't do that kind of activity, at least we don't have it as a doctrine, but it's clear that that would also give a country a certain amount of information and a certain amount of head start to be able to make the internet a safer place and actually prevent things from going wrong further down the line. And as we go further on that response continuum, further to the right, we get to the more the harder element of that spectrum. Imposing sanctions should have a certain deterrent effect. The European Union has, over the past year, negotiated a cyber sanctions regime specifically for cyber sanctions. It's amazing to see an organization like the European Union move so fast that they can actually set up such a regime, such a legal regime in half a year's time, which is for an organization of 28, 29 countries is amazingly fast, and it tells you what the sense of urgency is. So we're now in the process, literally as we speak in Brussels, to actually agree the first sanctions, so that we can actually slap sanctions on individuals and entities that have undertaken certain actions over the past years. It remains to be seen whether that's, again, something that does really prevent others from doing the same thing. But it does raise the price of certain actions, and it's certainly worthwhile in combination with all those other things to further develop. The United States also imposes sanctions on bad actors, and I think it's helpful to have several countries and several blocks of countries doing those kind of things and clearly send the signal that state actors cannot get away with the kind of stuff that they are getting away with at the moment. Then, of course, even further to the right on that spectrum, countermeasures, retaliation, although I understood from Catherine Lotriante we cannot use the word retaliation anymore. But it's very important to have the means at your disposal to actually strike back if necessary. And that's possible to do through the internet, that's possible with cyber means, cyber weapons, but it's also possible with kinetic strike, of course. We talked about NATO this morning. We have recognized the possibility that a cyber attack triggers Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, and that a cyber attack would actually be answered with a kinetic strike. Certainly, I believe, I've worked at NATO long enough, certainly I believe that cyber is going to be the first phase of any future conflict anyway. You're not going in, if you have the possibility to switch off the lights first, you'll do that, and it will be an integral part of any future conflict. So it's important to realize that all these different pieces of that continuum are developed at the same time, that we're trying to operate them at the same time, and that we're able to calibrate it and in a certain situation choose a certain tool in our toolbox to be effective. We have to get much better at that. So each and every part of this spectrum that I talked about is work in progress. It's not just work in progress because we're not good at it yet, but it's also work in progress because we're shooting at a moving target. Every time we think we have something fairly good under control, the internet has developed further, the cyber weapons have developed further, and the intentions of certain actors have developed further again. So it's a huge undertaking. It's something for a government. We like to use the word whole of government. It certainly is the whole of government that is involved in this. Every part, every department in our government can be affected by these kind of things, and so they have to be all part of the response. We are also trying to do as much as we can together with international partners. The reason why I'm here, although my wife thinks so, is not just the conference, it's also because it's an opportunity to speak with your government, and I spend most of my weeks in the year abroad, on the road, to speak with other governments, to agree this kind of approach and to make sure that every piece of this response continuum is linked to efforts of other countries, is linked to the private sector, and is linked to the civil society. The idea that we can do this between countries, between nations alone, of course, is by definition wrong. The open road is owned by the government, so the government decides where the traffic lights are set. The internet is not owned by the government, so we have to work with those other stakeholders. So international multi-stakeholder cooperation is the name of the game. It's like I said, a wide-ranging effort. We're trying to get better at it, and for sure we need the United States with us, we need the military with us, and we need basically every player that we can bring with us. Thank you very much.